She was sitting on the edge of the bed when he said it, her hands resting on her knees, the late afternoon light filtering through the curtains in that particular way that makes everything look softer than it really is, and for a moment she thought she hadn't heard him correctly. She thought perhaps he was joking, testing her, playing some kind of game couples play when they've been together long enough to think they know all the rules. But his face told her otherwise. His eyes were serious, almost pleading, and his voice carried that strange mixture of vulnerability and entitlement that she had learned to recognize over the years, the tone that said, "I'm being honest with you, I'm being brave," as if honesty alone could absolve him of what he was asking. He wanted to sleep with another woman for his birthday. He said it just like that, not as a question really, more as a confession, as if he had been carrying this desire for months and finally found the courage to set it down between them like a heavy stone. And she felt something inside her body respond before her mind could catch up, felt her nervous system activate in that ancient way it does when we sense danger, when the amygdala sends its urgent signals through our entire being, telling us that something is wrong, that we need to protect ourselves, that the ground beneath us is no longer solid. Carmen had been married for 7 years when this moment arrived, 7 years of building a life together, of shared routines and inside jokes, of compromise and accommodation, of slowly learning to shape herself around the edges of his needs, his moods, his expectations, and she had become quite good at it, at reading the weather of his emotions, at knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet, at making herself smaller so that the relationship could feel bigger, so that he could feel comfortable, so that everything could continue in the careful balance they had constructed together. But in that moment, with his request hanging in the air between them like smoke, she felt something shift inside her, something that had been sleeping for a very long time began to stir, and she recognized it as the part of herself she had been ignoring, the voice she had learned to silence, the girl she used to be before she learned that love meant sacrificing pieces of yourself until you weren't sure what was left. She didn't answer right away, couldn't find words that matched what she was feeling, and he misread her silence as consideration, as an opening, and he began to explain, to rationalize, to build his case with all the careful logic of someone who has already decided what he wants and is now simply looking for permission. He talked about desire and honesty, about how relationships need excitement, about how this didn't mean he loved her any less, about how it was just physical, just one night, just a birthday wish, and she listened to him spin this narrative, watched him try to make something fundamentally selfish sound like an act of relational maturity. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see because he had never really learned to see her, was that Carmen had been here before, not in this exact moment, but in the emotional territory this moment represented. She had been the girl who said yes when she meant no, who smiled when she wanted to cry, who agreed to things that violated her own boundaries because she believed that love required this kind of surrender. That being chosen meant being accommodating, that keeping someone meant becoming whatever they needed you to be. She grew up in a house where her mother's needs always came last, where her father's moods dictated the emotional weather of every day, where she learned that being good meant being quiet, that being loved meant not being too much, not asking for too much, not taking up too much space, and she carried this lesson into her adult relationships like an invisible script, playing out the same patterns without even realizing she was doing it, wondering why she always felt so empty, so exhausted, so hungry for something she couldn't name. The neuroscience of people-pleasing is written into our bodies from childhood. Our brains are incredibly adaptive, constantly learning from our environment what keeps us safe, what earns us love, what allows us to survive, and when a child grows up in an environment where their worth is conditional, where love feels unpredictable, where emotional safety depends on reading others correctly and adjusting accordingly, the nervous system learns to prioritize other people's needs above its own. It learns that the path to connection requires self-abandonment, and this learning becomes automatic, buried so deep in our neural pathways that we don't even recognize it as a choice anymore. It just feels like who we are. Carmen's cortisol levels had been elevated for years, her body living in a constant state of low-grade stress, always monitoring, always adjusting, always trying to keep the peace, and she had normalized this feeling, thought it was just part of being in a relationship, just part of being a woman, just the price you paid for love. But sitting there on the edge of the bed, Listening to her husband ask permission to betray her while calling it honesty, something in her system finally said enough. She thought about Isabel, a woman she had met at a workshop months earlier, a woman who had shared her own story during a group session, speaking in that raw, trembling voice that comes when you're telling a truth you've never said out loud before. Isabel had been with a man who slowly, methodically, over the course of years, convinced her that her boundaries were obstacles, that her discomfort was a limitation, that real love meant saying yes to whatever he asked, and she had tried, God how. She had tried, she had agreed to things that made her stomach turn, that kept her awake at night, that made her feel like she was disappearing, and she thought she was being mature, thought she was being open-minded, thought she was saving her relationship, until one day she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Isabel's story had stayed with Carmen, had planted itself somewhere in her consciousness like a seed, and now, months later, it was blooming into recognition, into clarity, into the understanding that what was happening in this moment wasn't about birthday wishes or sexual exploration or relational honesty. It was about power, about whose needs mattered, about who got to set the terms, about whether she was a person with inherent worth or simply a supporting character in someone else's story. The question her husband was really asking, beneath all his careful words and manufactured vulnerability, was, are you willing to hurt yourself to make me happy? And Carmen suddenly understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water on her face, that she had been answering yes to some version of this question for most of her adult life, in ways both large and small, in daily accommodations and unspoken compromises, in the slow erosion of her own desires in favor of maintaining harmony, in the gradual disappearance of the woman she had once promised herself she would become. Patricia was another woman Carmen thought about in that moment, a friend from years ago who had called her one night, crying so hard she could barely speak. Patricia's boyfriend had convinced her to open their relationship, had told her it was the evolved thing to do, that jealousy was just conditioning, that real love meant freedom, and Patricia, who desperately wanted to be the kind of woman who could handle anything, who could be cool and modern and undemanding, had agreed, had smiled through the pain, had pretended she was fine while her insides were screaming. And Carmen had listened to her friend fall apart over the phone, had heard the way Patricia kept apologizing for feeling hurt, kept calling herself immature and jealous and not enough, and Carmen had wanted to reach through the phone and shake her, to tell her that her pain was valid, that she wasn't broken for feeling betrayed, that saying no was not a failure but a form of self-respect. But Carmen hadn't known how to say those things then, hadn't fully understood them herself. She had offered sympathy but not the truth Patricia needed to hear, which was that you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, that real love doesn't require you to violate your own boundaries, that a relationship that demands your self-destruction is not a relationship worth saving. And now, sitting in her own version of that phone call, Carmen felt the weight of all these women's stories, felt the collective exhaustion of generations of women who had been taught that their worth was measured by their willingness to accommodate, to understand, to forgive, to diminish themselves in service of someone else's comfort. She stood up from the bed, her legs feeling strange beneath her, and she walked to the window, looked out at the street below where ordinary life was continuing, people walking dogs and checking mail and going about their evening routines, completely unaware that in this small bedroom something fundamental was shifting, that a woman was waking up from a long sleep, that the answer forming in her throat was going to change everything. When she turned back to face him, she saw confusion in his eyes. He had expected her to be upset maybe, to cry or argue or need convincing, but he hadn't expected this quiet stillness, this strange calm that had settled over her like a protective cloak. He didn't understand that he was witnessing a woman reclaiming herself, that the silence filling the room was the sound of someone finally, choosing their own dignity over someone else's desire. The words, when they came, were surprisingly simple, surprisingly clear. She said no, just that one word at first, no, and she felt it reverberate through her entire body, felt years of suppressed truth rising up through her chest, vibrating in her vocal cords, claiming space in the air between them, and then she said it again, no. I won't agree to this, no, this is not something I'm willing to do, no. Your birthday doesn't give you the right to violate our commitment, no, I matter too much to Pretend this is okay." He looked stunned, actually stunned, as if she had slapped him, and perhaps in a way she had. Perhaps he had grown so accustomed to her accommodation that he had forgotten she was a separate person with her own needs, her own boundaries, her own inherent worth. Perhaps he had confused her love with her compliance, had mistaken her patience for permission, had assumed that her past yeses guaranteed future ones, and now, confronted with a clear, firm, unwavering no, he didn't know what to do. He tried different approaches. He got defensive, said she was being closed-minded, prudish, controlling. He tried guilt, said he thought she loved him enough to want him to be happy, tried manipulation, said other couples did this all the time, that she was making a big deal out of nothing, tried bargaining, said maybe they could talk about it more, maybe she just needed time to get used to the idea, and through all of it Carmen stood firm, stood in her no like it was solid ground, like it was the foundation she had been missing all along. The neural pathways of people-pleasing are strong, carved deep through years of repetition, and breaking them requires enormous energy, requires us to override our automatic responses, to tolerate the discomfort of disappointing someone, to withstand the anxiety that comes from asserting our own needs. The brain experiences boundary setting as risky, especially when we've learned that safety depends on accommodation, when we've been conditioned to believe that love is conditional on our compliance, and so standing in that no, holding it steady against his pushback, against his disappointment, against the fear rising in her own chest, required Carmen to draw on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she had. But something surprising happened as she held her ground, something her nervous system hadn't expected. Instead of the catastrophe she had been bracing for, instead of abandonment or rage or the relationship collapsing immediately, she felt something else, felt her own power returning, felt her spine straightening, felt the fog that had been clouding her perception for years beginning to lift, and she realized that saying no, really saying no, wasn't the end of her, wasn't the disaster she had feared. It was actually, strangely, wonderfully, the beginning of her. She told him that she needed him to leave, not forever necessarily, but for now, that she needed space to think, to feel, to understand what she really wanted from her life and her relationships, and the look on his face told her that he finally understood this wasn't a negotiation, that something had fundamentally shifted, that the woman he thought he knew, the woman who had always eventually come around, who had always prioritized his happiness over her own discomfort, was no longer available. That night, alone in the apartment, Carmen sat on the couch in the dark and cried, but these weren't the tears she expected. They weren't tears of loss or fear or loneliness. They were something else entirely. They were tears of release, of recognition, of grief for all the years she had spent betraying herself, and underneath the grief was something else, something fierce and bright and alive, something that felt like coming home to herself after a very long absence. She began to understand, in the days and weeks that followed, how much of her identity had been built around accommodation, how many of her daily choices were driven by the question what does he need rather than what do I need, how much space in her mind was occupied by monitoring his moods, managing his reactions, keeping things smooth, and as she began to shift her attention inward, to ask herself what she actually wanted, what she actually felt, what she actually needed, she discovered vast territories of herself that had been unexplored, neglected, waiting. The work of reclaiming yourself after years of self-abandonment is not linear. It's messy and complicated and full of doubt. There were days when Carmen questioned everything, when the old programming kicked in and told her she was being selfish, unreasonable, that she should apologize and take him back and just try to be okay with what he wanted. There were moments when the anxiety of standing alone felt unbearable, when the familiar patterns of accommodation seemed so much easier than this new, uncertain path. But each time she felt herself starting to slip back, she remembered that moment on the edge of the bed, remembered the feeling of his request landing in her body like a violation, remembered the choice she had made to honor herself, and she found the strength to keep going. She started therapy, found a woman who specialized in relational trauma and boundary work, who helped her understand that what she had experienced wasn't unique, that countless women have been conditioned to prioritize other people's needs at the expense of their own, that the nervous system can be retrained, that we can learn to recognize our own worth not as something granted by others but as something inherent, unshakable, ours, and slowly, session by session, Carmen began to rebuild her relationship with herself, began to learn what it felt like to trust her own perceptions, to honor her own boundaries, to believe that she deserved respect not because she earned it through compliance but simply because she existed. The inner child work was particularly powerful. Her therapist had her close her eyes and imagine herself as a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, and Carmen immediately saw herself with her long dark hair and serious eyes, sitting alone in her childhood bedroom, trying so hard to be good, to be quiet, to not cause problems, and her therapist asked her what that little girl needed, what she would say to her if she could, and Carmen felt her throat tighten, felt tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry I forgot about you, I'm sorry I taught you that your needs didn't matter, I'm sorry I kept choosing everyone else," and in that moment something ancient and wounded inside her began to soften, began to heal, began to understand that it wasn't too late, that she could still become the adult that little girl had needed all along. She learned about the nervous system, about how the amygdala responds to perceived threats, how cortisol floods our bodies during stress, how dopamine reinforces behaviors that make us feel safe even when those behaviors are ultimately harmful. She learned that her people-pleasing wasn't a character flaw but a survival strategy, an intelligent adaptation to an environment where love felt conditional. And understanding this helped her have compassion for herself, helped her see that she had been doing the best she could with the tools she had, and now she was simply learning new tools, developing new strategies, building new neural pathways that would serve her better. There's a moment in recovery from people-pleasing when you start to feel anger, real anger, at all the times you betrayed yourself, at all the people who took advantage of your accommodation, at all the ways you were taught that your worth was conditional, and Carmen went through this phase, felt rage at her husband for asking what he asked, at her parents for modeling the dynamics they modeled, at society for teaching women that our value lies in our usefulness, our agreeability, our willingness to sacrifice, and her therapist helped her understand that this anger was necessary, that it was actually a sign of health, that we can't reclaim ourselves without first feeling angry about having lost ourselves, and the anger, when she let herself feel it fully, was clarifying, was energizing, was the fuel she needed to keep choosing herself even when it was hard. Months passed, and her husband tried various approaches to get her back. He apologized, said he had made a mistake, that he never should have asked, that he would do anything to repair the relationship, and Carmen listened to his words, watched him carefully, and realized that he was apologizing for asking the question but not for the worldview that made him think it was reasonable to ask. He was sorry she was upset but not sorry for treating her needs as negotiable. He wanted things to go back to the way they were, wanted her to come back, but he didn't seem to understand that the way things were was precisely the problem, that she had been slowly disappearing in that relationship, that going back would mean abandoning herself again, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she couldn't do it, that whatever happened next, she couldn't go back to being that woman who said yes when she meant no. She thought about all the women she had known over the years who had made similar choices, who had stayed in relationships that required their self-destruction, who had convinced themselves that love meant suffering, that commitment meant endurance, that maturity meant accepting the unacceptable, and she felt a deep sadness for them, for the way they had been taught to ignore their own pain, to rationalize their own mistreatment, to call their self-abandonment love, and she understood now that this was not love, that love, real love, doesn't ask you to disappear, doesn't require you to violate your own boundaries, doesn't treat your dignity as negotiable. She began to notice how different she felt in her body, how much lighter she was without the constant weight of managing someone else's needs, how much more energy she had when she wasn't spending it all on vigilance and accommodation, how her sleep improved, how her creativity returned, how she started to remember what it felt like to want things, to dream about possibilities, to imagine a future built around her own desires rather than someone else's demands, and she realized that she had been exhausted for years, chronically, profoundly exhausted, and she had normalized it, thought it was just how life was, but now, experiencing what it felt like to live without that exhaustion, She understood that it had been a symptom, a sign that something was deeply wrong, a message from her body that she had been ignoring for far too long. One afternoon, almost a year after that conversation on the edge of the bed, Carmen was walking through the park near her apartment, watching the light filter through the trees, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt peaceful, actually peaceful, not the forced calm of someone trying to hold everything together, but the genuine ease of someone who has found their center, who has learned to trust themselves, who knows their own worth. And she sat down on a bench and let herself feel it, let herself acknowledge how far she had come, how much courage it had taken to say no and mean it, how much work she had done to rebuild herself, and she felt proud, genuinely proud, of the woman she was becoming. The relationship with her husband ended, not with drama or cruelty but with the quiet acknowledgement that they had been trying to build something on a foundation that couldn't hold, that their ideas about love and respect and partnership were fundamentally incompatible, that she needed more than he was capable of giving, not because he was evil but because he had his own work to do, his own patterns to examine, his own growing to do, and she couldn't wait for him, couldn't make herself small. Again, in the hope that he would eventually see her, she had to keep moving forward, had to keep choosing herself, had to keep building a life that honored who she actually was rather than who she thought she needed to be loved. She started dating eventually, tentatively at first, and the difference was stark. She could feel immediately when someone wasn't respecting her boundaries, when someone was expecting her to accommodate in ways that felt wrong, when someone was treating her as a means to their own happiness rather than as a whole person with her own needs and desires, and instead of ignoring these feelings, instead of overriding her own perceptions, instead of talking herself into situations that didn't feel right, she listened, she honored what her body was telling her, she said no when she needed to say no, and she walked away from people and situations that required her to betray herself. And then she met someone different, someone who seemed genuinely interested in who she was, who asked questions and listened to the answers, who respected her boundaries without making her feel difficult for having them, who seemed to understand that love wasn't about possession or control but about two whole people choosing to build something together. And Carmen approached this new relationship carefully, with awareness, with intention, with a commitment to never again abandoning herself for the sake of connection, and it felt different, it felt clean, it felt like she could breathe. The neuroscience of healthy attachment shows us that we are capable of forming new patterns, of creating relationships that feel safe without requiring self-abandonment, when we experience consistent respect, when our boundaries are honored, when our needs are treated as valid, the nervous system begins to relax, begins to trust, begins to believe that connection and authenticity can coexist, that we don't have to choose between being loved and being ourselves, and Carmen felt this happening in her body, felt her system slowly unwinding years of hypervigilance, slowly learning that she could be seen fully and still be valued, that her worth wasn't dependent on her usefulness, that she was enough exactly as she was. She became passionate about helping other women learn what she had learned, started facilitating support groups, sharing her story, creating spaces where women could speak their truths without judgment, where they could explore their own patterns of self-abandonment and begin the work of reclamation, and she was amazed by how many women resonated with her experience, how many had their own versions of the birthday request, how many had spent years betraying themselves in the name of love, how hungry they were for permission to choose themselves, for validation that their needs mattered, for support in learning to set boundaries without guilt. She would tell them about that moment on the edge of the bed, about how her no had felt in her body, about the fear and the strength and the clarity, and she would watch recognition dawn in their eyes, watch them begin to imagine what it might feel like to say no in their own lives, to honor their own boundaries, to believe in their own worth, and she knew that this was her purpose, that her pain had not been wasted, that every moment of her own struggle had prepared her to hold space for other women's struggles, to be the voice she had needed to hear, to offer the permission she had never been given. Looking back, Carmen understood that the birthday request, as painful as it was, had been a gift in disguise. It had been so egregious, so clear, so impossible to rationalize away, that it had finally woken her up, had finally broken through years of conditioning and accommodation, had finally forced her to choose, and she had chosen herself, and that choice, that single moment of saying no and meaning it, had changed the entire trajectory of her life, had opened up possibilities she couldn't have imagined, had led her to a version of herself that was stronger, clearer, more whole than she had ever been. She learned that boundaries aren't walls, they're not about shutting people out or being cold or unloving, they're about honoring the truth of who you are, about creating space for authentic connection, about ensuring that your relationships are built on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. She learned that saying no is not selfish, it's necessary. It's how we teach people how to treat us, how we maintain our integrity, how we ensure that we don't disappear inside our own lives, and she learned that the right people, the people who truly love us, will respect our boundaries, will appreciate our honesty, will want us to be whole rather than convenient. The transformation wasn't just about romantic relationships, it rippled out into every area of her life. She became more honest at work, more willing to advocate for herself, more able to recognize when she was being taken advantage of and to address it directly. She became more selective about friendships, more willing to let go of relationships that felt one-sided or draining, more intentional about surrounding herself with people who saw her, valued her, celebrated her, and she felt the cumulative effect of these changes, felt herself becoming more solid, more present, more alive. There were still hard days, still moments when the old programming tried to reassert itself, when the voice of self-doubt would whisper that she was too much, too demanding, too difficult, that she should just go along to get along, that her needs weren't that important. But she had learned to recognize this voice for what it was, learned to talk back to it, learned to remind herself of everything she had gained by choosing herself. And the voice grew quieter over time, less insistent, less convincing. She developed a practice of checking in with herself regularly, of asking, what do I need right now? How do I really feel about this? What would honor my truth in this moment? And she learned to trust the answers that came, learned to distinguish between the voice of her conditioning, which told her to accommodate and please and disappear, and the voice of her authentic self, which told her what she really needed, what really mattered, what really aligned with who she was becoming and following. That authentic voice, even when it was scary, even when it went against years of programming, became the foundation of her new life. Carmen also learned the importance of community, of surrounding herself with other women who were doing this work, who understood the struggle, who could witness her growth and celebrate her victories and hold her steady when she doubted herself. She learned that we can't do this alone, that reclaiming ourselves after years of conditioning requires support, requires mirrors, requires people who can see us clearly and remind us of who we are when we forget, and she built this community. Intentionally, carefully, surrounding herself with women who were committed to their own growth, who honored boundaries, who celebrated authenticity, who understood that real friendship isn't about enabling each other's people-pleasing but about calling each other home to themselves. She thought often about the woman she had been a year ago, sitting on that bed, hearing that request, feeling her world shift, and she felt such tenderness for her, such compassion for how lost she had been, how hard she had tried, how much courage it had taken to finally say no, and she wished she could go back and tell that woman what was coming, tell her that the pain was temporary but the freedom was permanent, tell her that choosing herself was the best decision she would ever make, tell her that there was a whole life waiting on the other side of that no, a life where she got to be herself fully, where her needs mattered, where her boundaries were respected, where she was valued for who she actually was rather than for how well she accommodated. The birthday came and went that year, his birthday, and Carmen felt nothing, no guilt, no longing, no regret, just a quiet gratitude for the clarity that day had brought, for the wake-up call that had finally broken through her denial, for the chance to rebuild her life on a foundation of self-respect rather than self-abandonment, and she celebrated her own birthday that year with intention, with joy, with a commitment to keep honoring herself, to keep setting boundaries, to keep choosing her own dignity over anyone else's comfort. She wrote in her journal that night, wrote about the journey, about the lessons, about the woman she was becoming, and her final thought, the one she underlined twice, was this: the moment you stop abandoning yourself is the moment your real life begins. Everything before that is just practice, just preparation, Just learning what doesn't work so you can finally discover what does. And I am grateful, so deeply grateful, for the courage to say no, for the strength to mean it, for the wisdom to keep choosing myself even when it's hard, because this life where I matter, where my boundaries are honored, where I get to be whole, this is what I was made for, this is what we're all made for, and anyone who can't love me while I'm being fully myself doesn't deserve to love me at all. The neural pathways we build through repeated choices become our reality, and Carmen had spent years building pathways of accommodation, of self-abandonment, of prioritizing others over herself, but now she was building new pathways of self-respect, of boundary setting, of authentic expression, and these new pathways were becoming stronger every day, were becoming her default, were changing not just how she acted but who she was at the deepest level, and she could feel it in her body. Could feel herself becoming more solid, more grounded, more real. Years later, when women would come to her groups and share their stories, when they would cry and rage and slowly find their way back to themselves, Carmen would tell them about the birthday request, would tell them about that moment of choice, and she would say this: your no is sacred, your boundaries are not negotiable, your worth is inherent and unchangeable, and anyone who asks you to betray yourself to make them happy is not asking out of love. They're asking out of selfishness, out of entitlement, out of the belief that they matter more than you do, and you don't have to agree, you don't have to comply, you don't have to sacrifice yourself on the altar of someone else's desires, you can say no, you can mean it, you can hold steady in it even when it's hard, even when it's lonely, even when everyone around you is telling you to just give in, just be nice, just accommodate, because your life, your one precious life, is too important to spend it disappearing. And the women would nod, would cry, would begin to imagine what it might feel like to choose themselves, and Carmen would watch them with such tenderness, such hope, knowing that each of them was standing at the same crossroads she had stood at, knowing that the path forward was difficult but so worth it, knowing that on the other side of their fear was a freedom they couldn't yet imagine, a wholeness they had been longing for, a life where they finally got to matter in their own stories. Carmen understood now that the work of reclaiming yourself is never really finished, that it's an ongoing practice, a daily choice, a continuous commitment to honoring your own truth even when it's inconvenient, even when it disappoints others, even when it goes against everything you were taught. But she also understood that it gets easier, that the more you practice choosing yourself the more natural it becomes, that eventually your self-respect becomes so solid, so unshakable, that the old patterns lose their power, that you can recognize manipulation instantly, that you can set boundaries without guilt, that you can walk away from what doesn't serve you without looking back. She had become the woman she needed when she was sitting on that bed, had become the voice of wisdom and strength and clarity, had transformed her pain into purpose, her struggle into service, her breaking open into breakthrough, and she knew that this was what healing looked like, not the absence of scars but the ability to turn wounds into wisdom, to use what hurt you to help others, to let your story be a light for people who are still in the dark. The answer she gave that day, that simple, powerful no, had changed everything, had set in motion a complete reorganization of her life, her relationships, her sense of self, and she would never regret it, would never wish she had chosen differently, because that no had been the beginning of her yes to herself, her yes to her worth, her yes to a life lived in integrity and authenticity and truth, and that yes, that commitment to herself, was the greatest gift she had ever given or received.